There is an almost Orphic passage in Das Kapital in which Marx decides to cite the Book of Revelation, which means he has had a few and he and Engels are getting real deep in the pub trying to get a point across to some comrades more engaged by topics of the demonic hunger of the machine than sophisticated theories about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, even though naturally that is one and the same force of lack described in two different ways. He says, in their difficulties our commodity owners think like Faust, in the beginning was the deed. They have therefore already acted before thinking. The natural laws of the commodity have manifested themselves in the natural instinct of the owners of commodities. They can only bring their commodities into relation as values, and therefore as commodities, by bringing them into an opposing relation with some one other commodity, which serves as the universal equivalent. End of quote. Beyond acknowledging the sarcasm of the author when he considers the foreclosed sublimation of the commodity owners as they unconsciously elevate their natural laws and natural instincts to the supernatural, we might also wonder initially what is this universal equivalent, which facilitates the exchange between the two worlds and make it the commodity. What a strange symbol it must be that it can signify everything and still claim to signify something in particular, since identified particularity is arguably the whole point of making a point about something rather than everything. For when all things are presumed to be signified and the natural cautiousness of specificity is reduced to a reckless essence, we sense a lack in the argument of the other, a lack in the big other as such. Clearly they have run out of examples, and they are not strictly honest when they say, for example, it has always been like that, or as much as anything, same as usual, as with everything else, etc., etc. For how would they know? Unless they are one with that oneness, and the beatific is merely using them as a ventriloquist, which we might doubt. Yet the economy, as it's called, wouldn't work if it or we stopped taking this sublimation for granted. Just like a cop cannot do his work if he questions his orders too much. Marx goes on, quote, "We have already reached that result by our analysis of the commodity. But only the action of society can turn a particular commodity into the universal equivalent. The social action of all other commodities, therefore, sets apart the particular commodity in which they all represent their values. The natural form of this commodity thereby becomes the socially recognized equivalent form. Through the agency of the social process, it becomes the specific social function of the commodity which has been set apart to be the universal equivalent. It thus becomes..." Though you might have guessed it. We shall wait for it, and we will censor the symbol of what it thus becomes. The signifier itself remains absent just for now, and put in its place to replace it in the formula of our comprehension of the mentioned passage from the Book of Revelation that Marx cites. Here it comes, first in Latin, from yours truly, and then in English as footnote and flowing text swap plays depending on the snobbery of the translator of your country of origin, dear listener. Quote, Illiunum concilium habent et virtutem et potestatem suam bestia tradunt, et nequis possit emere aut vendere, nisi qui habet characterem aut nomen bestia, aut numerum nominis eius. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast, and that no man might buy or sell, save that he had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Revelation 17:13. The verse omits the word as well, but I will keep you for no longer. The word of the initial Faustian deed we are led to believe is money. But Marx said that to presume that would be to be acting before thinking, to take oneself to be the actor with a capital A. So we will, in honor of the holidays, humble ourselves to death like good Philippians and do some thinking. Graeber, in his Depth, the first 5,000 years, suggests in direct opposition to pre-Marx classical economy of Adam Smith et al. That debt and credit historically appeared about 3,500 BC. That is to say, with the first recognized class societies. And in addition before money, which itself appeared before barter. Which means for us that the archaeological record shows us a development which is the direct opposite of that which is the conviction of every yuppie, who will assume in childish projection of themselves as historical subjects to be agents of a cumulative latter perfected stage within the capacity of a chronological formula of primordial barter, which then needed money, which then needed credit, which then needed them. But if this is wrong, and the most complex actually came first, what did they count their credit in? What did they have to work with, so to speak, before there was even credit? When baseline communism reigned supreme? Well, of all the domesticated objects up for suggestion, one stands out as more suitable, in my opinion. First of all, because it lives a longer life than annual grains and stores even better than tubers. It also possesses some innate, natural tendencies of inflation and deflation. But perhaps most importantly, certainly so if you have some vegan convictions, because the very act of domesticating that which is alive, to turn a free animal into a beast of burden, marks the taming perpetrator of this act, which the book of Revelation really does suggest. For indeed you cannot imprison and whip senseless that which also gives milk to its young, without carrying the mark of the hoofed one. When someone assumed for the first time that they could own something that has nostrils, as the medieval Zen saying goes, and branded their cattle, they branded themselves. When they counted them, they quantified their own fate in the numerical name of the horned Lord, so as to now be able to buy and sell. And those who did this became of one mind, a mind which gives their power and strength to a hierarchy of valuing one's own freedom in the contrast of that which one has made a slave. And that is indeed to give unto the beast. it is not hard to see how this could very well have been the original Faustian bargain. The irresistible bribe of relieving mankind of burden through an unjust division of labor came at the hidden small print price of endemics for the first time ever becoming epidemics and pandemics through zoonotic pathogens. This curse is certainly unnatural rather than supernatural. But why does Marx nonetheless return to religion in this profound moment of conversation about a certain economical universality? Credit and debit as universal accounting units and the original mystification of their relationship suggests perhaps that religion and economy was once one and the same thing behind the temple gate of the law, where some learned to live deliciously. Graeber says of this, quote, "Or to take another curious connection, why were cattle so often used as money? The German historian Bernhard Laum long ago pointed out that in Homer, when people measure the value of a ship or suit of armor, they always measure it in oxen. Even though when they actually exchange things, they never pay for anything in oxen. It is hard to escape the conclusion that this was because an ox was what one offered the gods in sacrifice. Hence, oxen represented absolute value. From Sumer to classical Greece, silver and gold were dedicated as offerings in temple. Everywhere, money seems to have emerged from the thing most appropriate for giving to the gods." End of quote. To further deepen our suspicions, then, we could of course begin to acquaint ourselves with some of the early gods of agriculture. And here again we find the same mark. Since the oldest literary account of the Sumerian wild man was probably also the anthropomorphic bull man, whom gradually civilized and cultured under the name Enkidu, eventually became a compatriot of Gilgamesh in his fight against the forces of the wild and non-domesticated, i.e. the bull of heaven, the tiger, the lion, and the many other felines who had adorned, for example, the seat of our pregnant woman in Çatalhöyük. Wherever one looks in the cloud of unknowing, there takes place the metamorphosis of the horned one. And deity after deity of so many a people in distant lands across our world seemed to have walked the transformative path of domestication. Such is the life of some of the big Mesopotamian names: Moloch, Baal, and El, but also Shiva of the Indus, etc. And pitied are those who think they'll ever fully understand the many incarnations of Apis, the sacred bull of the Egyptians. So many cult figures of the cities and states had she lent her horns to along the Nile. Horus's mother Hathor, Osiris, Isis, to mention but a magical three, that the propagandists and religious intelligentsia of the late Alexander sensed an underlying structuring force in making something sacred out of the servitude of humanity's oldest slave. For though all civilized people of the new Hellenic Empire were many, and their religions often vastly different and opposed, they did seem to become of one mind, when contemplating the number of the beast. So perhaps Apis could unite them against any antler-wearing barbarians who liveth in the unregulated and untaxed eternity of Silvanus's dark woods. For as Plutarch said in conversation with Hermias, the geometrician, Protogenes, the grammarian, it is simply so that the upside-down oxen head is the first letter of the alphabet, because it is the first of all necessities. But it is clear to us that this necessity is a perverted necessity, and that all the oldest stories of the oldest clergies are trying to cover something up. Some simultaneous primordial crime and truth about the nature of domestication. So someone really should have asked these wise Greeks, who by then lived comfortably in imperial Rome, if all things that begins with alpha necessarily must imply an end with the yoke of omega.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome to the Return of the Repressed, dear listener. I have been lying in bed since Christmas. I'm a very sick person right now. But today felt like the first day that I might be able to pull off a recording. Whether you celebrate Christmas or not, I hope you got some holidays or days off, and that maybe some of you are still enjoying them. 1,000 thanks to all those who have commented on the episodes of this season so far, and those who have shared the show, which got quite the pump of new subscribers in December. I feel seen and appreciated, far from lonely, though I am quite alone up here in the mountains, which are starting to accumulate snow on their peaks. The other night I was lying in my hammock looking up at the sky, listening to a digitized audiobook cassette of one of Heyerdahl's early writings, and I felt the first crystal flakes land on my face. I then began pickling herring and prepared some 15 different Swedish Yule dishes for the Japanese side of the family, as we are staying here this time around, not being able to go back every time. It's quite expensive to fly to Europe. And on Christmas Day I went up in the night on an unlit, unmarked road which extends along one of the mountains, and I went through the forest until finally the road started to get icy and the trees covered in snow, and the skid alarm started to beep on my prompt in front of me. And I decided to go back down, which was a very cozy and very pleasant experience, because I was listening to a Swedish recorded poem of the Little Red Gnome, which later became Santa. And If you're a patron or a paid subscriber on Spotify, thank you so much for helping in providing a salary so that I can do this double full time while still having time for my boy and his discoveries. His most recent joy is that I'm his cow, which he can ride around in the house when going to sleep and turn off all lights before Papa goes back downstairs to keep reading. If you are not a patron, please compensate by using your social capital and share the show on Twitter, Reddit, etc. If you use an iPhone, please leave a rating and or review on iTunes to make sure I can also make free content out of this labor hour intensive research in the next year. Or, since this will be released after New Year, in this new 2025. In our exploration of the lies and damage that has been done to material history, the last episode left us with something of an anti-religious fervor. The intention was more in the way of instilling some anti-clerical sentiment, for I actually don't think we should give up the substance of religion altogether. We would lose something important by declaring it nothing but a hoax by the first patriarchs. As we will see today, religion, just as most things which we have investigated so far in this series, and to the great detriment of the contemporary monosphere, was an invention of class-free women, which led and guided mankind through that long period, which is known in Chinese history writing as Muxi Shizu Gongshe, the era of matrilineal communes. It was not the invention of civilization. And civilization, in its impotence, merely tried to institute an unproductive division of labor which made some of its subjects more religious than others. These priests had correctly grasped that the price mechanism of the market is based on scarcity, and that egalitarian abundance seriously disturbs this mechanism. That's why they had to strip some foodstuff of their use value and instead begin to extrapolate these grains and oxen's value within a divine structure of metaphysical valorization, which they also had to formulate. Of course they, the priests, could not make this subsumption of the worker formal if it did not already consist of religious stuff which people already related to. They had to cast their pantheon in a recognizable form, from days gone when all beasts were wild and free. So today I suggest we begin to look for traces of this lost tradition, which lays dormant in all of us. And by this I'm pointing a finger towards some of those Satori moments when, for example, you observe the moon on a cloudless night of great monochromatic contrast, and you are suddenly struck by the sensation that you are not actually looking up and away at that alabaster disc, but down and into it. Or the similar experience of gravitational appreciation that might visit you in the light of day when you find yourself sitting down in zazen for many hours and suddenly realize as the sun begins to approach its final descent that it is not actually moving at all, but it is you and this cherished earth that is moving at quite a noticeable speed. Or finally, just to really take this moment of sharing to heart, when you gaze up towards night's cupola, and gone is the standard two-dimensional perception of merely small and big sparkle, but instead there reveals itself a three-dimensional depth. I think epistemological ruptures like these are the reason some Mahayana teachers suggest that their teaching is timeless, and that there certainly existed Buddhas in the deep past, eons before Siddhartha, and that lineage fetishization which is so common in many schools of Buddhism, is a bit silly. But to really explore this in a historical sense, I think we must do something unorthodox. Let's not, I suggest, investigate only the megalithic industry of our Stony Hill People's Commune. No, let's begin by taking a look in the opposite direction, towards the microlithic industry, to see how we adorned ourselves in the days when everyone in the collective was a natural farmer by day and shamaness by night. Now the microlithic industries of our region of interest brings us to the aforementioned sister site of Göbekli Tepe, a few days' walk away, known as Bonçuklu Tarla. Bonçuklu Tarla is an at least 13,000-year-old site, initially older and later also contemporary with the others of the Stony Hill People's Commune, belonging to a people's commune of its own, which nonetheless shares many features. For example, it is in due likeness located within close proximity to one of the two major rivers of later Mesopotamia, with the possibility of connecting them to the rest of the world. As did, according to Heyerdahl, all of the much later so-called first cities, like the harbors of Ur, Uruk, Mohenjo-daro, etc. They feature also communal buildings, domestic housing, storage spaces, and unconstructed or open communal spaces. The head of the excavation team, Ergül Kodas, unlike his seniors, Özdogans and Schmidt, and their temple mania of the 90s, has speculated that buildings up to 8 stories high and reaching a height of 7 meters could have been possible, and they are not referred to as temples. Personally, being a fan of public housing, I'll call them prehistoric apartment blocks, and they were made possible by that previously mentioned lagoon river marl concrete. Kodas says in the conclusion of his 2021 article, quote, "The communal building brought to light at Bonçuklu Tarla manifests the central element of the village fabric. It is located in the center of a group of houses of varying sizes and shapes. The communal building is the sole structure of rectangular shape, while the domestic structures are either circular or subrectangular. There are, in addition, other collective, non-constructed spaces located among the houses, which allows for flow-through traffic. We have been able to define 4 specific types of spaces in the village of Bonchuklu Tarla: the communal building, the domestic houses, the storage spaces, and the non-constructed communal spaces. End of quote. In addition to these most impressive aspects, he has also emphasized the aforementioned suggestion that the architecture culturally ties together these clusters of communes, dotted all around the many sub-rivers that eventually flow into the Tigris and Euphrates, and finally out to the Persian Gulf, the Omani Bay, and the Arabian Sea. A common cultural region which Kodas identifies as the Nemric culture, which begins to express itself through regional variations and similarities, at least as early as before the end of the Younger Dryas. Regarding the microlithic industry of this time, which I hope will give some color to our understanding of the religion which our early communists invented, at Bonchuklu Tarla alone, of which only 5% have been excavated, they have found impressive tools of jewelry designs, metalworking and gem cutting, and hundreds of thousands of ornamental pieces, which pushes back the beginning of the history of this art many thousands of years beyond the Wikipedia civilizational standard and the generic name-dropping of the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Beads made of various different beautiful gemstones, with polished marble veins of different hues and colors, ranging from jade and serpentine-like green, lapis lazuli-like turquoise and deep blue, and other metamorphosed limestone fades of tan, red, vermilion, ochre, etc., as well as decorative items of glass and crystal, obsidian, even copper. The copper has both been cold and heat-worked, and together with different clay modifications, they have been fashioned into not only necklaces, bracelets, rings, etc., but also earrings, piercings, stretcher plugs, and labrets. Pieces which gives us glimpse of a practice of the transgression of bodily boundaries, so widespread among these communes that it is forcing the archaeologists to invent a new grammar and language for this corporal alteration through ornamentation. After all, if 5% of excavations have turned up this much so far, then we could ultimately be looking at an artistic industry that produced millions of jewelry objects at a single site. Furthermore, the permanent adaptation of lips and ears and the augmenting of the human form prove to us that these communists had such immense swag that it makes the bling of the chieftains of the Bronze Age, and this is just my personal assessment as a fan of accessorizing, look desperately tacky by comparison. But not only that, this prehistoric, pre-agricultural attention to beauty is once again an indication that these people had the time to focus on so many other things than just survival. Their individual drip, rather than individual style, experimented with ways of expressing their own identity in ways of being interconnected with others, emphasizing the importance of social relations formed through communal rights, duties, responsibilities, accomplishments. An exploration of the nature of mutuality which is current and relevant. We could say that when everyone was a philosopher queen, they wore their unwritten golden rules as crowns. And seeing these things in a recent documentary about the site sparked life in me with such immense heat and flame. Images of my childhood hobby of collecting and arranging beautiful river stones, and my later adult tasks of producing recitation malas in the monastery, that it became utterly clear to me that these people had everything already figured out. They were not bothered by life. They lived it. I think the aesthetic, integral difference between the individuals of the commune and the individuals of Bronze Age trends is nicely summarized by, for example, Scandinavian pre-Viking Age chieftains, who made coins of themselves in Roman fashion, but with bundles of made-up letters trying to copy something they didn't understand were words, names, and a functional alphabet. Somewhat similar to Andrew Tate, who thinks his tattoo depicts a snake fighting the devil, because that's a nice metaphor for the warrior that he is, he says. But actually it's not the devil. It's a Japanese ogre Oni, which is usually warded off by throwing around soybeans in the house once a year like a soy boy. An even nicer metaphor of Andrew having lost the war against his internal idiot. Oni wa soto. Victor Turner, a Scottish anthropologist of the 60s onwards who wrote about symbols, rituals, rites of passages, and especially something called liminality, which is the disorientation that occurs in the middle stage of a rite of passage when participants no longer hold their pre-ritual status, but have not yet begun the transition to the status they will hold when the rite is complete. Which is sort of what me and Gaspar were unconsciously referring to when discussing the cringeness one feels when attending demos and trying to make the jump from bootlicker to raging rebel in the Christmas special. Turner says in his The Ritual Process, Structure and Anti-Structure from 1969, quote, "We have been too prone to think in static terms, that cultural superstructures are passive mirrors, mere reflections of substructural productive moods and relations, or of the political process that enforce the dominance of the productively privileged. If we were as dialectical as we claim to be, we would see that it is more a matter of an existential bending back upon ourselves. The same plural subject is the active superstructure that assesses the substructural and structural modalities that we also are. Our concreteness, our substantiality, is with us in our reflexivity, even in the ludic play domain of certain of our liminal moments. Play is more serious than we, the inheritors of Western Puritanism, have thought." End of quote. According to Turner, this existential bending back of the superstructure onto ourselves reveals that there always already exists a quote-unquote sacred comradeship of the quote-unquote comunitas. Quote, the surface of the body as the common frontier of society, the social self and the psychobiological individual becomes the symbolic stage upon which the drama of socialization is enacted, and bodily adornment in all its culturally multifarious forms, from body painting to clothing, and from feather headdresses to cosmetics, becomes the language through which it is expressed. End of quote. According to Milena Vasic, another anthropologist who seeks to problematize the so-called revolutionary aspect of the Neolithic, stressed that pre-agricultural communities knew very well, for no one knows how long, that, quote, the body, and consequently its adornment, is not just a reflection and expression of dominant cultural values, but also an arena for construction, negotiation, and performance of these values, and consequently the identities, with the power of mediating our relationship to the world around us. End of quote. I remember that when I started to paint illegal Buddhist street art in between my stays at the monasteries of legal icon painting, I also started without instructions or any real thought to paint my body with the ash from yesterday's campfire, and tied more and more hemp strings around my ankles and wrists, like insignias of task competition. But there is a danger here. Great Master Huang Longhui Nan once wrote a song poem in the 1st century of the 2nd millennium, when the Xiaoxiang, or poems of exile, i.e. the leaving bureaucracy and abandoning one's mandate genre, was becoming popular, as the state for the first time acquired the powers of paper money and banknote stamps. This poem discusses the relationship between adorning oneself and the enlightenment of dropping out. And you will have to listen to this one a few times if you really want to get at what he is getting at. And I recommend to pay special attention to the difference between I and eyes, singular and plural. Quote, how wondrous the Buddhas in the 10 quarters are. From the first they have been flowers in your eye. If you desire to make the acquaintance of the flowers in your eye, they are of course the Buddhas in the 10 quarters. If you desire to make the acquaintance of the Buddhas in the 10 quarters, they will not be flowers in your eyes. If you desire to make the acquaintance of the flowers in your eyes, they will not be the Buddhas in the 10 quarters. When you understand this clearly, the blame will lie with the Buddhas in the 10 quarters. When this is not yet clearly understood, Shravakas are prone to dance, and Pratyekaya Buddhas take to adorning themselves. End of quote. As used here, the term Shravakas refers to those who enjoy hearing the teaching but are not necessarily interested in its practical application, believing that they are already enlightened because they have an intellectual understanding of the teaching, and therefore they jump for joy. On the other hand, Pratyekaya Buddhas are those who are seeking enlightenment but just for their own sake. When they believe that they have fully fathomed enlightenment, they wear their understanding as a badge of their achievement, which means that we cannot trust someone just because they adorn themselves in imitation of our original nature. It must come naturally, as it were. which is also why I've spoken about the advent of class society as a betrayal, since the subjugation of women by men and/or class-free subjects by a ruling class was carried out within the capacity of a symbolic order which the former had invented and which the latter imitated and vulgarized. Now, before we go on, if you are still wondering about the flowers and you feel a bit confused, then kindly enough, Great Master Dogen said in his commentary of Huainan some 200 years later, quote, "Because the matter is like this, both your being clear and your not yet being clear are flowers in your eye, and they are also the Buddhas in the 10 quarters. Your desire to be acquainted with what they are and what they are not is the wondrous manifesting itself, and it is a great wonder. The main point about the flowers of unbounded space and the flowers of the earth, of which Buddha after Buddha and ancestor after ancestor have spoken, is their giving free rein to their elegantly skillful means. Even though academic teachers of scriptures and scholars who produce erudite commentaries thereon are able to hear the words flowers in unbounded space, there is no account of anyone, apart from an ancestor of the Buddha, who has ever encountered or even heard of the lifeblood of the flowers of the earth. And there are the sayings of the Buddha's ancestors who have understood what the lifeblood of the flowers of the earth really is." End of quote.
Sings the Vedic, a penitent right to sin. Toward redemption, strength attends the seeker. A sovereign dreadnought breathes and approach the state serene. Interiorizer of the mind from word to breathe. Nicodemus awaits in vigil weeping. The Arhat rising and the healing ghost descends. Lamentations cease and the rarefied light prevails. Tibetic gleams sing freedom from Tomasic field.
Now getting back to Bonchuklutarla, where people really desired to acquaint themselves with the lifeblood of the flowers of the earth. We must note that possibly millions of valuable objects suggest a storage that is more than qualitatively long-term or quantitatively large, but indeed, like the practice itself, eternal. Yet despite this immense wealth, Kodas, in the 4 latest publications that I had the time to read by him, makes no mention of an elite priest class. Instead, what we do find, if we join him in trying to map the quote-unquote communal cultural region and its cultural relationships, which Kodas has done on some very indicative maps, as to understand the far reach of these peoples, we notice, at least from what I can see, that they must have had contact with that other commune-building culture of West Asia, the Natufians. And from what I can gather in my research of texts concerning the region from the time of the fall of biblical archeology in the 90s, the Natufian culture appears to have already enjoyed the use of pretty much all the technical means that would later become necessary to the first farmers of domesticates and later the first civilizations. Jacques Cauvin, a very important veteran archaeologist regarding the religion of prehistory, who passed away in 2001 and whom we will introduce in a short while, said that, quote, "Until the much later invention of the plough and animal traction, the people of the Neolithic had no new tool to invent in order to pursue their strategy of farming production. Everything they needed already existed in the Natufian culture, and sometimes even earlier, among the hunter-gatherers of the advanced Paleolithic." End of quote. And seeing as the Natufian culture began 15,000 years ago, we will add that very few researchers, if any, have had the audacity to push back their robed psycho-alchemical elite to these days. So we find ourselves here in pretty much undisputed egalitarian terrain. The sedentary village life they have been said to have invented covers multiple hectares and as such is also better referred to as communes than villages, involving sedentary and more mobile housing, food forests of pistachio, almonds, and many other nut trees and berry bushes, an excess of lush plains, meadows, and grasslands of wild lentils, peas, beans, and many other legumes, cultivation, but not yet domestication, of wild grains and cereals of various kinds. Among these, ultimately hundreds of kinds of beyond organic plant food stuff which they consumed, there is even proof that some Natufian mobile groups returning back home from their distant journeys brought back with them wild figs from Africa to the collective storehouse. These people, as far as we know, brewed the first beer 13,000 years ago and made the first pita bread 1,400 years before that. Now we often jokingly say that craft beer and sourdough baking quickly becomes religions for those who get into it, and their evangelization is perhaps only matched in annoyance by those energy vampires who will never shut up about different strains of weed, which I'm sure these people had some stereotypes of among themselves as well. For jokes aside, more importantly, that there was some impressive superstructural, ideological appreciation for these arts of flour making, wild grain harvesting and processing, can be seen on the shafts on some of their knives and sickles, which again, any artisanal baker of the farm-to-loaf movement of today would pay good money for. They are often long, beautiful ivory figurines, polished and cut in one piece, depicting different kinds of grazing animals like goats, wild sheep, gazelles, etc. when we learn later in this series about the roles of these animals in the evolution of wild grains, these choices of small totemic icons will begin to make a lot of sense. No less attention has been invested in the other means of production of wild cereal flour industry, and there is a possibly 14,000 years old large polished stone mortar found at Einan that really stands out in terms of its polished symmetrical beauty, which again looks high-end even to modern standards. The same goes for their very round two-part grinding stones, which I want so damn badly. That some of these most impressive means of production are flanked by much more rudimentary versions of similar use value brings once again another serious point to light. Because just as with the ceramics of East Asia and the Pacific, we find indications of a decline in the technical proficiency of the Natufian production of the means of production after the Younger Dryas. Gauvin says, quote, "It was very early noted that over the course of the 2,500 years that the Natufian lasted, there was clearly development of the culture through time in the direction of simplification. For example, there was a progressive reduction of its most sophisticated elements, seen equally in the mood of retouching on the microlithic tools and in the impoverishment of the bone industry, which loses its most complex tools, and in the near disappearance of portable art objects. This cultural development has been confirmed by recent work in the Mediterranean zone of the southern Levant. Even more evidence has come from the extension of research to the Negev, Jordan, and the northern Levant." End of quote. The bone industry concerns, for example, among others, adorned fishing hooks and advanced harpoons. And not to sound too much like Hancock, but what did the Ice Age communes know that was lost during the Younger Dryas catastrophe? And where did they come from? In one way the answer lies in plain sight, as the so-called Levantine corridor, where all things are said to begin, leads to an even earlier beginning in Africa. But before we go there, let's also consider, suggests Gauvin, quote, "the remarkably well-constructed sedentary settlements of the Pavlovian and the Gravettian," end of quote, made by black-skinned and blue-eyed Europeans. A pigmental point which I add not only because it seems to be the most plausible theory right now, but also, of course, because it pisses off all the white supremacists in their Indo-European thought experiments. These northern communists are most famous for their many Venus statues, and lived in Ice Age Europe some 25 to 33,000 years ago. That is even before the Ohalo II site, generally considered the first experiment of sedentism, though the dwellings needed to fight prehistoric Siberian winds disagree, and I think also the Venus statues disagrees. For is it not clearly a homage to the pregnant woman who cannot follow the hunt, who demands quite correctly that sometimes we need a base camp where we can feel at home and bury our dead and give birth to our living? And this idolization of fertility goes both ways, since if you want to stay in the same place for a long time, you naturally desire milk to flow from the bosom of the earthess and the earth as well. So you need to start constructing the landscape and make it more fit for natural farming. A black sheep at Cambridge called David L. Clark had already suggested as much back in the 1970s to the detriment of his institute's hierarchy. but would unfortunately be long dead before the first evidence started to come in during the fall of biblical archeology. An abstract from 1999 states, quote, "Although it is almost 25 years since David Clark argued that there would have been substantial plant use during the Mesolithic, i.e. roughly at the end of the last glacial maximum and the Neolithic revolution, 20,000 to 5,000 years ago, clear evidence to support his argument in terms of sites with large quantities of plant remains continue to be elusive in the archaeological record." In this paper we describe the plant remains from the site of Stausnig on the Isle of Colonsay in western Scotland, which appears to provide precisely the type of evidence that Clark anticipated. End of quote. The paper, titled Plant Use in the Mesolithic, Evidence from Stausnig, Isle of Colonsay, Scotland, is referring to, was a recently discovered prehistoric technique of roasting hazelnut in earthen pit ovens, or rather, a discarded batch or batches from such a roasting of possibly 50 to multiple hundreds of thousands of hazelnuts gathered from some 5,000 trees. The batch was discarded because some intern had probably overstepped the threshold of delicious and accidentally charred the nuts. Such gourmet pickiness, as the authors conclude, does not suggest an opportunistic or incidental level of plant food exploitation. Another research team discovered similar patterns around the same time in Ireland, where the first of the true temperate forest trees and shrubs, including hazel, began arriving about 10,000 years ago. The relative success of hazelnut has led some ethnobotanists to suspect large-scale arborist management, since, quote, by 9000 BP, that is less than 1,000 years later, Ireland was covered in hazel thickets, and the shores of inland lakes were awash with hazelnuts, end of quote. In a more recent publication from 2022, called Getting to the Root of the Problem, New Evidence for the Use of Plant Root Foods in Mesolithic Hunter-Gatherer Subsistence in Europe, researchers have found evidence of consumption of roots, tubers, rhizomes, bulbs, and corms. Corms, for those who don't know, are, for example, of those that I have experience with, the many kinds of taros and Chinese water chestnuts. And if you are a younger listener looking for adventure, I can share a tip of an elusive Frenchman who appears from time to time in the different harbors of Southeast Asia with his modified catamaran. He accepts volunteers and sails to isolated islands of the Pacific and Oceania, introducing new interesting varieties of taro, such as the giant swamp taro, to impoverished indigenous communities, helping them reach self-sustainability, one comunita at a time. You can still find him on the woofing site, I believe. 15 years ago, his only demands were that you read 2 books by a French author, possibly he himself under pseudonym, who wrote about turning your boat into a floating farm and living off it. The Getting to the Root report describes how difficult it is to find evidence of plant use in Ice Age Europe, and why archaeologists almost have to depend on major fuck-ups in the preservation process, such as the aforementioned charred hazelnuts batches. Quote, the cooking techniques, especially the pit cooking, required a great deal of skill and expertise. From the author's own experience, the type of soil, the number of rocks used, the amount of water added, and the placement of the food in the pit are all crucial in determining whether the cooking will be successful. Too many rocks and too little water can result in a burned or overcooked product, whereas too few rocks and too much water will not cook the food adequately. End of quote. But with the continued demise of old Cambridge prehistoric authority, the evidence is nonetheless growing, and so are the numbers of authors suggesting the possibility that the more than 90 native European plants with edible undergrowth made up staple food economic bases. And thanks to the remains of the apprenticeship periods, when daughters of Ireland and Scotland allowed their little brothers to make big mistakes, I think we can continue to make believe that the idolization of the needs of the pregnant Venus, rather than the desires of the alpha male, goes hand in hand with the idolization of the managed landscape and seasonally sedentary life. And I also want to point out that when praising over 30,000-year-old sedentary sedentarianism in Europe, which also made possible textile impressions made into wet clay, which gives us some of the oldest proof of the existence of weaving by humans, we are not lowering our esteem for mobility. Quite the opposite, since the non-compulsory nature of it, in my opinion, is precisely what makes it into an exciting adventure for the break-off groups who reassuringly knows they have a safe home and harbor to return to. For I ask you, dear listener, to picture that journey that made sure that the teenage mammoth hunters buried in the frozen tundra of that famous triple burial at Donji Vestonice in today's Czech Republic were laid down to finally rest with seashells from the faraway Mediterranean, prized objects that still magically kept the sound of the warm ocean as it lulled their spirits to sleep. Were they lovers, as the embraced positioning suggests? Did their homosexual relationship develop out of the two having to take care of the third with the deformity? Did they swear upon the conch, which is still today one of the 8 symbols of enlightenment in the Tibetan land of snow, and promise each other that they do everything until the very end to make sure their deformed friend had a life worth living? I'm sure if we hold up the symbol of wave-filled emptiness and listen carefully, we can still hear the answer of compassion in their 26,000-year-old cries and laughter. when talking about offerings. In a famous 12,000-year-old burial of a Natufian Shamaness at Hilazon Taktit Cave, we find rare artifacts that seem to come from all over. There are the remains of at least 3 aurochs, the wild forebearer to our today's cattle, which were becoming more and more sacred before their final extinction. 86 tortoises' shells which had been treated with heat, which in the absence of satisfying interpretations makes me think of the very similar ancient Chinese divination practice known as Jia Gu Wen, literally shell and bone script. I have found no one suggesting this connection, but Jia Gu Wen was the prehistoric practice of writing characters onto tortoise shells and then baking them and studying the way in which it broke up the script. In my opinion, I think such original cleromancy, before it was partly vulgarized with superstition in the I Ching or I Jing, are examples of early experimental searches for true randomness. A noble endeavor which even contemporary aleatory materialism and mathematics with its chaos theory of the butterfly effect, etc., in no way considers a done and fully explained phenomenon. My theory is that the breaking up of oracle shells had something to do with a lottery of sorts, of making decisions about the organization of the social formation in the transitory period of the Shamanesses' absence. The liminal space, as it were. This is, for example, how the distant descendants of the Venus statues in the Teutonic communes allocated land in the absence of patriarchal inheritance laws, which inspired the latter Marx in his theories about quote-unquote indigenous communism, when searching for pre-capitalist shortcuts to socialism, which did not depend on the technical improvement of the productive forces alone. Since Russian female revolutionaries, which we met in the hemp series, had begun suggesting to him that surely the absence of capitalism in certain non-European communities was perhaps not just a sign of backwardness or a delay of the inevitable, but rooted in various enforced social, anti-hierarchical mechanisms. If you are a big fan of Chinese hexagrams, or if your eye is more keen than mine to spot actual evidence of clairvoyance, I admit that I still find the study of changes during the Western Zhou very intriguing, and we should remember the danger and historical failure of structuring a system of inspired leaders in an uninspired way. What I mean by this, our shamaness will soon make clear. For she was also surrounded by the pelvis of a leopard, the forearm of a boar, a wingtip of a golden eagle, and a skull of a beech marten. We can read in the way her bones have fallen that she was touched by Satori in a very extreme way, as is often the case with these collective Buddhas of old, and which is something that is hard to replicate through organized ritualization alone. Upon this discovery, the excavator of this particular burial, Leor Grossman, later examined historical accounts of shamanesses worldwide, and found that in many cultures, shamanesses often possessed physical handicaps or had suffered from some form of trauma. According to Brian Hayden, an archaeologist at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, Canada, quote, "It's not uncommon that people with disabilities, either mental or physical, are thought to have unusual supernatural powers," end of quote. Often accounts of this discovery on the internet obscure many of these facts because disabled female Buddhas and hundreds of thousands of years of matrilineality organized on principles of welfare rather than brutality still terrify a lot of people, especially the open-minded pseudo-historians of the manosphere. Great Master Dogen, however, said some 800 years ago to a new batch of not yet dry behind the ears seekers of the way, quote, "A female monk to whom the treasure house of the eye of the true teaching has been transmitted should respectfully be bowed to and asked for the teaching by those in the 4 stages of Arhathood, those who are Pratyekaya Buddhas, and those thrice wise and 10 times saintly, and she will acknowledge this bow. Why should only males be worthy of respect? Boundless space is simply boundless space. The 4 elements are simply the 4 elements. The 5 skandhas are simply the 5 skandhas, and they are no different from women. When it comes to realizing the way, everyone may realize it. In any case, anyone who has realized what Dharma is should be deeply respected. Do not concern yourself with whether it is a man or a woman. This is a most excellent rule of the Buddha's way." End of quote. 5 skandhas, by the way, is the senses: hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, tasting, etc. And if we return here briefly to the point stressed by Lee Clare and Flint Dibble in their discussion regarding Klaus Schmitte's idealist use of words like priests and temples, which is partly to be blamed for all the misogynist New Age obsession now surrounding the site of Göbekli Tepe, I think we can deepen this critique to understand in what way bourgeois thought is incapable of thinking about collective shamanism, and instead automatically presume a clerical religious division of labor. Mehmet Özsogan, whom we met in the last episode as one of the biggest archaeological proponents of this idealist theory, has as his primary excavation site Tsayönyu, which I believe he worked on as a leader since the 90s, where I'm sure he did a lot of good, admirable, actual work. But unfortunately, due to his interpretation, Tsayönyu has today on its Wikipedia site as first cited source the book Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods by Andrew Collins. Collins is a Stargate grifter who has worked and supported former National Socialist Party of America founder Frank Joseph in his Atlantis research. This model of an antediluvian synarchist, often quasi-biblical, secret elite society as the keepers of esoteric knowledge, the activities and decision of which moves history in certain directions, is supported in some way by almost all of the big grifters who at some point will or have already appeared on Joe Rogan, from Hancock to Jimmy Corsetti to Dan Richard, etc., etc. This was originally intended both practically and theoretically as an alternative to the theory of class struggle. I have touched upon this briefly before with reading Colin, but we never got the time to really dig into it. But John Anthony West, their guru, who I think Hancock even at one point in one of his books, can't remember where, identified as the man behind the revival of this theory, at least in the English-speaking world, and who also appeared on Rogan's show before he died, got this idea from a French scene of suspects, Alexandre Saint-Yves de Alvierde and René Guyon, etc., whom West and Hancock do cite in their own books, but only in an occult context, never in a practical, political and parapolitical sammanhang, which you don't have to be Lyndon LaRouche to identify, though he did write about it, which is basically the French turn-of-the-last-century version of the theory of the original Aryan Männerförbund, or secret men's band. Now, since a lot of Swedes were also involved in this historical psyop, I have been thinking about doing a standalone episode about it, which if you feel like that would be something worthwhile, please comment and encourage me to read my brain to mush again in the original languages, and you will have it.
That's roughly the idea. So it's interesting that the ancient Egyptians have a notion of an epoch that they call Zeptepi, which is the first time. It means the first time. This is when the gods walked the earth. This is when 7 sages brought wisdom to ancient Egypt. And that is seen as the origin of ancient Egyptian civilization. There are king lists by the ancient Egyptians themselves. There are king lists that go back way beyond the first dynasty, go back 30,000 years into the past in ancient Egypt, considered to be entirely mythical by Egyptologists, but nevertheless, it's interesting that there's that reference to remote time. Now, what you also have in Egypt are what might almost be described as secret societies. The followers of Horus are one of those, specifically tasked with bringing forward the knowledge from the first time into later periods. The souls of Pe and Neken are another one of these mysterious secret society groups who are possessors of knowledge that they transmit to the future. And what I'm broadly suggesting is that those survivors of the Younger Dryas cataclysm who settled in Giza may have been relatively small in number. It's interesting that they are referred to in the Edfu building text as 7 sages, because that repeats again and again. It's also in Mesopotamia. It's 7 sages, 7 Apkallu, who come out of the waters of the Persian Gulf and teach people all the skills of agriculture and of architecture and of astronomy. It's found all around the world that there was a relatively small number of people who took refuge in Giza, who benefited from the survival skills of the hunter-foragers who lived at Giza at that time, and who also passed on their knowledge to those hunter-foragers. But it was not knowledge that was ready to be put into shape at that time. And that knowledge was then preserved and kept and handled within very secretive groups that passed it down over thousands of years, and finally it bursts into full form in the 4th dynasty in ancient Egypt. And you know, the notion that knowledge might be transferred over thousands of years shouldn't be absurd. We know, for example, in the case of ancient Israel, it goes back to the time of Abraham, which is pretty much, I think, around 2000 BC, and knowledge has been preserved from that time right up to the present day. So if you can preserve knowledge for 4,000 years, you can probably preserve it for 8.
This historical development model of misogyny and class obscuration is, however, not only the stuff of pseudo-archaeology. It thrives, as we are beginning to see, in standardized academia as well. Tsayenius' fate on Wikipedia is strictly speaking not Özdogan's own fault, but it is at least clear to me that he and Schmidt, as 2 towering examples of well-established archaeology in West Asia after the official fall of biblical archaeology, have an insatiable thirst for civilizational hierarchical male signifiers, which as an idealist whole is to be blamed for the contemporary rise of pseudo-archaeology. I think the very fact that many debunkers and skeptics, etc., are incapable of identifying the issue as such is why they get so nasty in their critique of each other. You and I, on the other hand, dear listener, have the history and the souls of thousands of dead female rebels on our side, which help us see both fields as the 2 sides of the same crypto-Caesaristic coin. In short, they ultimately, in terms of engines of history, write about the same stuff. Özdogan in academic anti-Mesopotamic-centric jargon, with quasi-Abrahamic religious undertones, and Collins et al. In dope-smoking ancient aliens prose with crypto-Nazi overtones. It's funny that Özdogan himself hasn't noticed that. Since 20 years ago he wrote with quite a lot of insight about the topic of political nationalist influence on archaeology, pointing out that Yugoslavia and academia at one point performed an absurd Balkanization of prehistory, separating the sites that make up the link between Asia and Europe among themselves according to their own contemporary cultural borders, rather than those from tens of thousands of years ago. He also identified how Bulgaria, the only strictly pro-Russian country of the region, almost disregarded prehistory altogether in favor of Iron Age archaeology, having been inspired by the Promethean ethos of space-race Soviet communism, which preferred starry sky chariots over radical democratization of the productive forces. Özdogan, in nationalist self-critique, even noted how Ataturk, during the dawn of Turkey, baffled his own intelligentsia when basing Turkish identity-seeking archaeology not on Central Asiatic excavations, as his ethnographers suggested, but instead on an inauthentic social linguistic heritage of prehistoric and ancient Anatolia itself. A made-up original language as a tool of interpretation and interpellation, insofar that it became state-sanctioned propaganda after the fall of the Ottomans, was, as we know, a false gift to Ataturk from the new European Areo-heroic project, which, as Özdogan correctly recognized, have always defined West Asia in different ways, depending not on material evidence but on their own views of themselves, holographically based on whether the pendulum at that moment of research in Paris, London and Berlin had swung towards Near East diffusionism or self-made continental isolationism. Yet the bourgeois politics of his own ill-chosen hierarchical signifiers, destined to make Anatolia the elite theocratic cradle of civilization, seems to escape him. And here finally comes another dent in the underlying assumptions about our people's communes, which both well-established idealist archaeology and pseudo-archaeology share, despite, as suggested, often pretending to be sworn enemies. Quoting Lee at length, quote, "Despite the occurrence of objects interpreted as prestige items and subtle differences in grave goods in some burials in the upper Tigris basin, archaeological evidence for vertical social differentiation in the pre-Pottery Neolithic A and B remains tentative. In the case of the two burials found at Göbekli Tepe, these have also failed to provide any signs of the social status of the interred individuals. There is also no clear indication of hierarchies in the architecture, unless we follow suggestions that the special buildings were the homes of clan leaders. As for the dominant governance by spiritual leaders and the elite competition proposed by Özdogan and the kin-based lineages of individual entrepreneurs suggested by Bar Yusuf, these hypotheses are difficult to corroborate. Indeed, the available evidence for social elites, or rather the lack thereof, is more in line with a less rigid form of social differentiation." End of quote. That the traces of a supposed elite theocracy of quacks, sidekicked by a nepotistic class of entrepreneurs, as an engine of history, is nowhere to be seen in the days of Göbekli Tepe, as it is absolute sacred bullshit, I think spontaneously makes sense to most. But just to make sure, let's highlight that Lee is backed up in his critique of this Randian prehistory fantasy by another veteran archaeologist called Ian Hodder, who started off at Leeds University in the 70s and who has been excavating Çatalhöyük as a director since the 90s. Hodder, in addition, is a pioneer of what is called post-processual archaeology, which aims to finally overcome the limitations of the positivist legacy which haunts archaeology and anthropology, even when it rebranded itself as new archaeology before becoming processual, within quotes. Post-processual archaeology shares a lot of tenets with Marxist archaeology, having initially been inspired by French Marxist anthropology and structuralism in the 60s, especially in terms of its emphasis on human agency. And it is in this vein that Ian Hodder suggests that, quote, societal mechanisms at Göbekli Tepe were in place to subconsciously preserve egalitarian social systems, end of quote. That is to say, not invent, represent, or preserve an exclusive class of priests. He says further in his Staying Egalitarian and the Origins of Agriculture in the Middle East from 2022, still writing at the age of 74, quote, I have argued elsewhere for a long, slow Neolithic, in which humans and things get increasingly entangled, drawing humans into intensifying pathways. After years of debate, it seems clear that the single cause explanations for sedentism and agriculture have remained elusive, while long-term processes of climate change and material entanglement played a role. A variety of specific proximate causes were involved at different places and times within a polycentric process. Some role for social and ritual factors has long been argued. I have suggested that remaining egalitarian may have been another causal factor. The evidence suggests a continual tension between various forms of hierarchy and egalitarian principles, at times leading to impressive outpourings of creative ingenuity, as at Göbekli, Jericho, and at many pre-pottery Neolithic A sites. Before the development of intensive integrated agriculture, these systems allowed egalitarian principles to be pursued through community sharing and notions of nested balance between parts. But creating and regulating the superstructures or overdetermined codings for these systems was often demanding, leading to a shift towards greater autonomy of individual units and more focus on fragmentation and dispersal. Fueling this process was intensification, end of quote. In Hodder's philosophy, there is a class-theoretical duality of what he calls molar and molecular, which we will not be able to elaborate upon here, but we will make an attempt eventually, as it defines much of the latter developments of intensification and domestication, which will help us to make sense of our historical betrayal. But this elementary dualism is nonetheless, in addition, quite fitting for our religious investigation, as a dualistic ideology does seem to arise in these regions in the days of our people's commune. In the coming episodes, I will try to give a full rundown of what has occurred to me during my many hours of shikantaza, or just sitting down to ponder this very Taoist problem. I really want to develop these thoughts in fully baked fashion as to not only avoid misinterpreting those who has made a career out of interpreting this proto-religion, but also as to be able to convey the messages of some of the early translations from the Eastern cloisters, which I made of that most translated book in history, the Tao Te Ching, which lays forth the concepts of yin and yang. Which is no easy task when you realize that dualism is a lot more than just a theoretical identification of opposites. And as I believe I have stated on this show before, that the famous Taiji presumed to be the Taoist symbol par excellence, you know, the one with the black and white kidney-looking form forces and enveloping each other in a beautiful circle, is not actually, strictly speaking, a Taoist symbol, but rather a Neo-Confucian appropriation from the days of the greatest cultural hegemonic tendencies that the pre-modern world had ever experienced. When bureaucracy and the proto-bourgeoisie mandarins came to power during the Song dynasty, and the state really started to function in its truest Kafkaesque sense. When, as I said earlier, paper money and stamps truly became icons of an iconosphere, and when all that was once holy melted into air. And we shouldn't uncritically take part in such a process, for it is described in the Communist Manifesto to be the activity of capital. The process of our critique of the clerical powers that be might simply become the melting down of statues of Buddhas only to make bronze mirrors for the aristocracy, as a Chinese monk put it thousands of years ago. Which is something Lee, in his critique of Schmidt's temple priesthood theories, has noticed as well. That is to say, as stated in the intro, we should not throw away religion as a prehistoric factor altogether for the sake of preserving egalitarianism. For we can here begin to explore the workings and ideas of what he and others call collective shamanism and the superstructure it constructed, which in addition is precisely why I went so hard on biblical archeology and theocratic readings earlier. Since as a former monastic monk I'd be damned before I let some conformist Seventh-day Adventist lay evangelical claim to the symbolic law which was invented by communists and anarchists long before patriarchal Yahwehism inoculated these lands. And Lee is inspired in this regard by French archaeologist Jacques Cauvin, whom we met before, and who in the 70s and 90s wanted to move away from the biological fundamentalism of domestication theories, and instead put forward a theory of a prehistoric ideology that initially inspired, but then went on to ultimately fool our natural farmers to get caught in the labor traps of the plow. Cauvin, like most archaeologists, does not recognize natural farming as a distinct intermediary mode of production, predating agriculture and superseding hunting and gathering. After all, that is something I have almost made up on my own, based on my interpretations of their own work and my own experience. And I'll now go on at length to describe just why he might have been aided by my assumptions had he still been alive. For I would argue that this lack of nuance of his, when nonetheless putting emphasis on longer-term change, undermining the revolutionary suddenness of the Neolithic Revolution, etc., causes some issues for his methodology. For he very interestingly puts the advent of religion before the invention of agriculture, which means in neo-Marxist fashion that a superstructural determinism produced lasting change in the economic base rather than the other way around. And not just any lasting change, since agriculture of the Neolithic is recognized as the most fundamental change in human history ever to have happened. Furthermore, if this is true, it really brings to ruin the early assumptions of, for example, Levi-Strauss, who insisted upon a demarcation line between the savage mind and the modern mind, which today has been taken to ever greater extremes by so-called cognitive archaeologists and evolutionary psychologists, who just like the Aryan naturalists, though in a more cryptic pseudo-universal format, believe in an evolution of religion, and are forced to consider all the Neolithic material changes of history, insofar that they will eventually manifest as tools of domination under civil society, prototypical prerequisites for real thinking as such. Obviously, as we have begun to see, these so-called prototypical prerequisites were not conscious decisions aiming for class society, and some of them, like trade or barter, never even existed at that time to any defining degree, and definitely not with the hopeful thoughts of one day having universal means of exchange like money or weights and measurements defined and legally upheld by royal decree. But this non-teleological factuality of historical change doesn't really bother these thinkers, as they are at the end of the day hopeless bourgeois apologetics for the contemporary order of things as an ever-frontiering pinnacle. And insofar that they use this class-free invention of agriculture to be a once-in-a-historical lifetime event that all cultures must go through to be able to think, and think properly as to reach the zenith of civilization, I feel, of course, that it's a great irony of the history of ideas that all these, the most reactionary of neurosciences and hard genetic inheritance, base their entire evolutionary premises on a simplified version of the concept of the Neolithic Revolution, which, as we saw in a previous episode, was invented by a Marxist. And in this respect, Cauvin's suggestion of quote-unquote purely mental developments, i.e. fully autonomous changes of the superstructure, not dependent on the technological changes of the economy, or indeed brain structures, or whatever it is that, that the neuroscientist or the cognitive archaeologist thinks, are actually quite fine, I think, mainly because it's so upsetting to vulgar materialism of both the orthodox Marxists, the positivists, and the naive realists. But I will modify it a bit for our purposes some 30 years later. And since he himself eventually added a more dialectical approach of an interplay of changes between the material base and the superstructure, as to be expected, I state again that I think he would have been helped a great deal by my notions of a prolonged, intermediary economic base between agriculture and hunting and gathering, i.e. natural farming, which the more I deepen the study of this original conviction, seems to have taken up most of our time as humans. Maybe even before that. The happening at the center of his theory, Cauvin calls the symbolic revolution. He was, as a scholar, the subject of French theory in the 60s and 70s, after all, when Freud and Marx first met and became comrades in the Lacanian Althusserian tradition. And in his defense, this emphasis of the symbolic order, which ultimately in the psychoanalytic sense denotes language as a causal law for basically everything, the non-linear complexity of the psyche, beyond the cognitive brain of a staircase model, and finally the ahistorical eternal nature of the unconscious, will of course little by little also become useful in our continued discrediting of the various quote-unquote revolutions or sudden steps of that staircase model. Cauvin begins exploring the existence of this symbolic revolution with a focus on the Natufian culture, as we saw above, since that is where he has put in most of his work in the field. A Natufian Levantian southern culture which seems to have shared long time spans of cultural relationships with the proposed Nemric Anatolian culture of our more northern people's commune. I guess we could say, considering the overlapping map of self-adornment objects, and in recognition of this superstructure, that they collectively shared a religion. And regarding this West Asiatic prehistoric spirituality, the lead archaeologist of Göbekli Tepe, Claire Lee, cites Cauvin when the latter states in his most famous book, and I believe the only one which has been translated into English, The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, quote, "The most primitive societies always find in their midst some inspired individuals, whose function simply results from a spontaneous recognition among their fellows of a natural superiority that applies in certain defined circumstances, in the same way a war leader in a certain Paleo-Indian tribes only remained chief as long as the war continued. No more than for the sanctuaries in Paleolithic caves does the specialization of place imply some irregular and institutionalized specialization of one element within the society, nor any power other than that which results from the occasional exploitation of personal competencies, which must always have existed. We should not therefore attribute to the pre-pottery Neolithic sanctuaries more than they speak for, nor because of them push back the dates of the process of urbanization. The concept of an egalitarian structure for Neolithic societies does not seem to us, therefore, to be threatened in the least. End of quote. I believe we can conclude again here regarding the aforementioned anointment of more charismatic leaders of collective shamanism by saying that classlessness does not mean that there aren't from time to time inspiring and inspired leaders. It just means that there aren't structures in place to automatically reproduce them in an uninspired fashion. Which in Buddhist terminology means that these subjects of the hammer and sickle lit their stone lanterns to shine a light upon this very problem. Lanterns, the decoration of which exhibit a flagrant disproportion between the considerable time required for their manufacture and their debatable utility, as they were not just rationally surviving in anticipation of civilization. Now Kovan sees in the central part of the flame of these vessels of phenomenological and symbolic illumination what he calls the duality of the woman and the bull, which we will become more and more acquainted with. He suggests that maybe the pregnant women of the West Asiatic symbolic revolution is related to the Venus figurines of Ice Age Europe, which I already independently suggested with regards to the Pavlovian and Gravetian cultures. So if we were to end today's investigation of what is known in historico-theoretical Mao Zedong thought as the hundreds of thousands of years of Muxi Shizu Gongshe, the matrilineal communes, let's do so by repeating something about the beauty of, for example, the Monrus Venus Mother, which I wouldn't mind having as an upscaled installation in bronze or tin due to its amazing, possibly Bauhaus or Soviet suprematist expression. I'm quite serious, look it up and tell me where we are at in the historical staircase in terms of abstract art. The Monrus Venus. For if the pregnant woman is a spiritual signifier of sedentary life and fertile landscape construction, we have to finally begin to look into the history of the wild cereals that made natural farming possible. For such an undertaking, the undertaking of establishing the non-agricultural economic base of the first religion, will surely and necessarily take us back to the landscapes of Mother Africa, at the other earlier end, that is to say the beginning of the Levantine corridor. And that is what we will finally do in the next episode, because considering all we have talked about tonight, the charges have been set, things are in position, and we are ready to push the button and do some irreversible damage to our perception of history. This means that we will have to leave Göbekli Tepe for a while. So let's end here today like last time, for I want to bring your attention to a detail present in many of the T-pillars that have occupied me, which are those beautifully carved circular holes that even Lee suggests no one really knows what they are for. When they are present in the Venuses, like the aforementioned Monru's mother, they are presumed to be merely functional, presumably used to pull a string through. But since that is impossible, I think in addition they give off very strong phallic mother energy. And I'm not vulgarly talking about a woman with traditionally masculine characteristics, but that one mother image which might replace in our uncanny imagination the anxious image of Melanie Klein's devouring mother of cannibalistic fantasies, which Lacan argues stems from the first of the family complexes, which is the weaning complex, in which the interruption of the symbiotic relation with the mother leaves a permanent trace in the child's psyche, and which in our materialist sense is when the child will have to be fed by the earth and what she can give, which of course is the most feared and respected devouring big mother, the earthess of terrified delights. And I believe I have found her ancient lake, which might be older than mankind itself.
الحمد والنعمة لك الملك لا receipts.